The chair beside the Duke's writing desk had not been moved. Every servant in Thornmere Hall knew the ritual. Each morning, the first footman positioned the velvet chair at a precise angle, 3 hand-widths from the desk's edge, turned slightly inward, a silent invitation waiting to be spoken aloud. When the Duke received a guest, he would gesture toward the chair, and that single word, "sit," was the opening note of every audience, every negotiation, every meeting held within those oak-paneled walls. But this morning, the chair sat untouched. The velvet cushion bore no impression. The Duke had not spoken that word. The woman had stood the entire time. No one knew her name. She had arrived shortly after 9, on foot, carrying a leather satchel worn soft at the corners. She wore no mourning clothes, no finery, just a plain traveling dress the color of wet stone and a pair of gloves that had been mended more than once. She had asked to speak with the Duke on a matter of urgent business. The butler, quote, Sedgwick had noted her composed bearing, her educated voice, and, against his usual practice with uninvited visitors, had admitted her. She was inside the study for less than 3 minutes. What passed between them, no one heard clearly. The scullery maid stationed nearest the door caught only fragments. The Duke's voice, low and clipped, and then silence. No raised voices, no argument. The woman emerged with her satchel still in her hands, her face pale but perfectly still. She walked down the long corridor at an unhurried pace. She did not look at the portraits on the walls. She did not glance at the servants who had found sudden reasons to be polishing brass in the entrance hall. She simply opened the heavy front door herself, before the footman could reach it, stepped into the raw October drizzle, and walked down the gravel drive until the mist swallowed her whole. She did not look back. That evening the talk in the servants' hall was of nothing else. Who was she? What had she wanted? And why had the Duke, a man whose coldness was legendary but whose manners were never once in question, refused her the simple dignity of a seat? But the question that unsettled them most was the one posed by old Marin, the cook, who had been at Thornmere longer than anyone alive. She stood at the head of the kitchen table, ladling broth into heavy bowls, and said it quietly, almost to herself. What kind of woman walks into a Duke's study carrying something to say, gets turned away without so much as a chair, and leaves without saying it? No one had an answer. 2 weeks later, the same woman appeared at the servants' entrance, asking for work. The horse's name was Vesper. She was a black Arabian mare, 17 hands tall, with a coat that shone like polished obsidian when the light caught it and turned to dark silk in the rain. Her eyes were large, liquid, and startlingly intelligent, the kind of eyes that seemed to hold understanding far beyond what any animal should possess. She had been a gift from the Duke to his younger sister, Lady Rosabelle, on her 20th birthday. The two had been inseparable, Rosabelle riding Vesper across the moors before dawn, her laughter carrying back to the house on the wind, a sound so full of life it made the old stone walls seem warm. Rosabelle had died of scarlet fever that spring. She was 23. Since her death, Vesper had become untouchable. She refused grain from the groom's hands. She kicked the walls of her stall until the timber cracked and splintered. She had bitten the stable master so severely that the man still wore the scar on his forearm 6 months later. When they turned her loose in the far paddock, she would stand at the fence line, facing the house, motionless for hours, as though waiting for a footstep, a whisper, a hand on her mane that would never come again. The Duke had ordered her kept. He could not bring himself to sell his sister's horse, but neither could he bear to see her. Vesper existed in a state of exile, fed but unloved, alive but abandoned, a breathing vessel of a grief the household had no language for. The stable hands feared her. The groundskeeper crossed himself when she screamed in the night. Even Mr. Garston, the estate steward, a man who took pride in solving every practical problem the property produced, had suggested more than once that the animal be sent to auction, or worse. "She is a danger, your grace," he had said, his tone careful and perfectly reasonable. "A liability the estate cannot afford." The Duke's answer had been 3 words delivered without looking up from his papers. "She stays, Garston." And so Vesper remained, wild, grieving, and magnificent, a dark flame pacing the edges of the estate, untouchable and alone. No one dared approach her. Not until Nell arrived. No one had told Nell about the horse. She had been at Thornmere for 5 days, assigned to the lowest duties, scrubbing the kitchen flagstones before dawn, beating the rugs, emptying the ash grates while the house still slept. She worked without complaint, her movements quiet and precise, her face a calm mask that gave nothing away. The other servants had already formed their opinion. She was odd, too still, too watchful. A woman who had once stood in the Duke's own study did not belong on her knees with the scrubbing brush, and that contradiction made them uneasy. It was on the 6th morning that it happened. Nell had been sent to the pump house behind the stables to fetch water for the laundry. The path took her along the edge of the far paddock. The October mist hung low, turning the landscape into a watercolor of grays and muted greens. She walked with her head down, her shawl pulled tight against the damp, the wooden buckets knocking softly against her legs. She heard the sound before she saw the horse, a low, trembling breath, half whinny, half sigh. She stopped. Vesper was standing at the fence, no more than 10 feet away. Her black coat was beaded with moisture. Her dark eyes were fixed on Nell with an intensity that was almost human. Nell did not move. She did not speak. She simply stood there, the buckets resting on the ground at her sides, and looked back at the animal. 1 breath. 2. 3. Then Vesper did something she had not done since Rosabel's death. She lowered her great head over the fence rail and stood perfectly still, waiting. Nell said nothing. After a long, quiet moment, she picked up her buckets and walked on. But she looked back once, just before the path curved toward the pump house, and the horse was still watching her. The second time was in the kitchen garden 3 days later. Nell was on her knees, pulling weeds from between the herb rows, when a shadow fell across the soil. Vesper had found the gap in the hedgerow, a gap that had been there for months but that she had never once used, and now stood among the lavender, her nostrils flaring gently, her gaze settled on Nell with that same quiet, searching expression. The gardener's boy saw it and sprinted to fetch the stablemaster. By the time the man arrived, breathless and gripping a lead rope, Vesper had already gone. But the hoof prints in the soft earth told the whole story. The third time was the one that made them all talk. Nell had been hanging linens on the drying lines behind the house. The wind was sharp, snapping the white sheets like sails. Vesper appeared at the edge of the yard. Having somehow let herself out of the paddock entirely, she walked, not bolted, not charged, walked calmly across the open grass and stopped 3 paces from where Nell stood. Then she waited, her breathing slow and even, her great head lowered, as docile and patient as a house cat. Nell did not reach out to touch her. She did not flinch. She continued hanging the linens, moving around the horse as if the animal were simply part of the landscape. When the last sheet was pinned, she gathered her basket and walked back toward the house. Vesper followed her to the kitchen door and stood there until nightfall. By the end of the week, every servant in Thornmere knew. The horse that no one could touch had chosen the strange new maid. And not a single soul among them could explain why. Mr. Garston did not raise his voice. He never needed to. The estate steward of Thornmere Hall was a man of meticulous authority, tall, lean, with a narrow face and pale, calculating eyes that missed nothing. He had served the estate for over a decade, first under the old Duke, now under his son, Lord Rowan Ashenmore. He managed the rents, the tenancies, the timber yields, the household accounts. Every shilling that entered or left the estate passed through his ledgers first. His power at Thornmere was second only to the Duke's, and in practical daily matters it often exceeded it. He did not like disorder. The situation with the horse was disorder. He found Nell in the scullery the morning after Vesper had followed her to the kitchen door. She was elbow-deep in gray water, scrubbing a blackened copper pot. He stood in the doorway, blocking the light, and let the silence announce him. "The horse damaged the kitchen garden fence last evening," he said. His voice was quiet, measured, the tone of a man reading from a balance sheet. "The gardener estimates £2 for repairs. That is £2 the estate would not have spent if you had not encouraged the animal." Nell did not look up. "I did not encourage her, Mr. Garstin." "Then you will explain to me how a horse that has refused all human contact for 6 months has suddenly taken to following you across the grounds like a trained spaniel." "I cannot explain it, sir." "No," he said, his pale gaze narrowing. "I don't imagine you can." From that morning, Nell's duties changed. The regular rotation she had barely begun to settle into was stripped away. She was reassigned to the oldest, most neglected corners of the estate, the cellars beneath the guest wing, where damp crept through the walls and the air smelled of mildew and cold earth, the disused servants' quarters on the 3rd floor, where sheets had not been turned in years, the coal stores, where the dust blackened her hands and clung to her hair no matter how many times she washed. Her meals were moved to the end of the kitchen rota. By the time she sat down, the food was cold and the other servants had already cleared out. No one intervened. Garstin's authority over the domestic staff was absolute, and his displeasure was something no one wished to share. But the isolation served a second purpose, one that Nell understood immediately. She was being kept from the main house, from the corridors where the Duke walked, from the rooms where the estate records were stored, from the study where, 2 weeks earlier, she had stood before a man who would not offer her a chair and swallowed the most important word she had ever carried. She was being buried alive, and the walls were closing in. Her name was not Nell. Her name was Eleonora Severin, and the leather satchel she had carried into the Duke's study that October morning held the key to a fortune he did not know he was owed, and the proof of a betrayal he did not know had been committed. Her father, Aldrich Severin, had been a cartographer and surveyor of uncommon skill. A quiet, scholarly man with ink-stained fingers and a passion for precision. He had spent his career mapping the great estates of northern England, their boundaries, their mineral rights, their ancient claims. He was not wealthy, but he was respected. His work was meticulous, his reputation spotless. He had raised Eleonora alone after her mother's death, teaching her to read maps before she could read words, to calculate acreage before she learned arithmetic in a schoolroom. 7 years ago, the old Duke of Ashenmore, Rowan's father, had commissioned Aldrich to conduct a full boundary survey of the Thornmere estate. The work was extensive. Thornmere's land stretched across nearly 4,000 acres of moorland, forest, and river valley, with holdings that dated back to the Tudor grants. Centuries of informal agreements, verbal easements, and shifting fence lines had left the legal boundaries in a state of quiet chaos. The old Duke, a careful man who sensed his health was failing, wanted the record set straight before his son. Inherited Aldrich had spent the better part of 2 years on the survey. He walked every fence line. He compared every deed to every stone marker. He consulted parish records, county archives, and manorial rolls that had not been opened in a generation, and in the course of that work he had found something that should not have existed. A parcel of land, nearly 600 acres of dense woodland, on the estate's northern boundary, land known locally as Blackthorn Hollow, had been quietly transferred out of the Ashenmore holdings 8 years prior. The transfer documents bore the old Duke's signature, but the terms were extraordinary. The land had been signed over to a private company for a fraction of its assessed value. The company, Aldrich discovered, was registered to a single director, a man named Holt Garstin, the elder brother of the estate's own steward. The land was sitting on one of the richest seams of coal in the county. Holt Garstin had already begun leasing extraction rights to mining concerns. The profits were substantial and growing. None of them flowed to Thornmere. Aldrich had been methodical. He had copied the original deeds, the fraudulent transfer documents, the company registrations. He had drafted a detailed report with cross-referenced maps showing the discrepancy. He had prepared everything to present to the old Duke. He never got the chance. 3 weeks before his scheduled meeting with the Duke, Aldrich Severin's reputation was destroyed. A series of anonymous complaints were filed with the county surveyor's office, alleging that his boundary work on 2 previous estates had been fraudulent, that he had falsified measurements to favor the landowners who employed him. The complaints were detailed, convincing, and entirely fabricated. His commissions were suspended pending review. His name was removed from the professional register. The old Duke, already gravely ill, was advised by his steward, Mr. Purist Garstin, that the surveyor's work was unreliable and should be disregarded. The survey was shelved. Aldrich's final report, the one containing the proof of the Blackthorn Hollow fraud, was never delivered. Aldrich had fought. He had written letters, filed counter-petitions, sought legal counsel, but he was one man with modest means against a machinery of influence he could not see. His savings were consumed by legal fees. His health, never robust, collapsed under the strain. He died 14 months later, in a rented room above a printer's shop in Harrogate, with his daughter at his side and a satchel full of maps and documents on the chair beside his bed. "Don't let it die with me, Nell," he had whispered, using the name he had called her since childhood. "The proof is all there. Thormere is owed a fortune, and the man who stole it is sitting at the Duke's own table. Promise me." She had promised. It had taken her 2 years to find the courage and the means. She had survived on seamstress work, on tutoring the children of a sympathetic vicar, on the quiet charity of Aldrich's few remaining friends. She had studied the documents until she could recite them from memory. She had learned everything she could about the new Duke, his character, his habits, his reputation for cold, exacting fairness. And then she had walked to Thornmere Hall on an October morning and asked to speak with him. She had planned her words with the same precision her father brought to his maps. She would present the facts. She would show him the documents. She would explain, calmly and clearly, that his estate had been defrauded of 600 acres and an income worth thousands of pounds a year. She was not asking for payment or reward. She was fulfilling a dead man's promise. But the Duke had not offered her a chair. He had glanced at her, a brief, dismissive assessment, and spoken to her as one speaks to a peddler or a petitioner. He was busy. Whatever she had come to discuss could be directed to his steward. His steward, Mr. Garstin. She had stood there, the satchel heavy in her hands, the words gathering behind her teeth. She could have spoken anyway. She could have laid the documents on his desk and forced him to look. But something in his manner, the absolute certainty that she had nothing of value to offer, had frozen the words in her throat, not out of fear, out of something more complicated. She had come to help this man to honor her father's dying wish, and he had looked through her as if she were made of glass. She had left. She had walked down the gravel drive with the satchel still full and her promise still unkept. And then, in a boarding house 3 miles from the estate, staring at the damp-stained ceiling of a room that cost her last reliable shillings, she had made a decision. If the front door was closed, she would enter through the back. If the Duke would not hear Eleonora Severin, then perhaps he could be made to see Nell, the maid, the quiet woman who scrubbed and polished and watched and waited. She needed access to the estate office. Somewhere in Garstin's own records, his ledgers, his correspondence, his private files, there would be the other half of the proof. The payments, the contracts, the trail of money flowing from Blackthorn Hollow into Holt Garstin's company. Her father had the maps and deeds. Garstin's office would have the financial evidence. Together, the case would be unassailable. So Eleonora Severin had folded her father's satchel into the false bottom of a battered trunk, put on a plain gray dress, and walked to the servants' entrance of Thornmere Hall. Garstin, the brother of the man who had destroyed her father, had looked at her forged references, nodded once, and hired her himself. Rowan Ashenmore, the 7th Duke of Ashenmore, stood at the tall window of his study and watched the woman cross the stable yard. She was carrying a water pail in each hand, her slight frame leaning against their weight, her steps measured and sure on the uneven cobblestones. Her shawl was damp, her skirt hem was dark with mud. She was, to any casual eye, unremarkable, one more servant in a household that employed 30, performing one more task in an endless rotation of tasks. But Vesper was walking beside her. The mare moved at the woman's pace, her great black head lowered, her stride shortened to match the maid's smaller steps. There was no halter, no rope, no command. The horse simply walked with her, as naturally as a shadow follows its source. When the woman paused to shift her grip on the buckets, the horse paused too. When she moved again, Vesper moved with her. Rowan pressed his knuckles against the cold glass. He had not ridden Vesper since Rosabel's funeral. He had not been able to look at the animal without seeing his sister's face, laughing, wind-blown, luminous with life. Vesper had been Rosabel's creature entirely. Her death had turned the mare savage, and Rowan had accepted it as natural. Grief made wild things of us all. He had given the order to keep the horse fed and housed, but left alone, and he had not thought about it again. Now he thought about it. He thought about the groom's report last Tuesday, that Vesper had stood calmly while the new maid walked past, that the mare had lowered her head over the fence as if asking to be touched. He thought about the gardener's account of the horse, appearing in the kitchen garden, standing among the herbs like a creature enchanted. He thought about the kitchen boy's breathless description of Vesper following the woman to the door and standing there still as carved marble until dark. And now this. The two of them crossing the yard together in the thin morning light, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Garston had mentioned it, of course. The steward had raised the matter with his usual bloodless efficiency, framing it as a liability. The horse was dangerous. The maid was either reckless or manipulative. Either way, the situation needed to be corrected before someone was injured and the estate faced legal complications. Rowan had half listened, as he often did when Garston spoke of domestic concerns. The steward was thorough, relentless in his attention to the estate's interests, and Rowan had come to depend on that relentlessness. Running Thornmere was an enormous burden. The rents, the tenants, the crumbling infrastructure of a house that had been slowly consuming itself for decades. Garston managed the machinery of it all, leaving Rowan free to carry the weight of the name, the grief, and the suffocating responsibility that had descended on him the day his father died and his sister followed him into the earth 6 months later. He trusted Garston. He had no reason not to. But something about the scene below his window unsettled that trust, not with evidence, but with instinct. The woman was not performing. There was no audience in the yard, no one to impress. She was simply doing her work, and the horse was simply with her. The bond between them was not dramatic, it was quiet. And that quietness carried a weight of authenticity that Rowan, despite his habitual suspicion of all things emotional, could not dismiss. He remembered the morning she had come to his study. He had been deep in the quarter's accounts, irritated by an unresolved discrepancy in the timber revenues. Sedgwick had announced her, an uninvited visitor, a woman without an appointment or a card. Rowan had granted her 3 minutes out of a vague sense of duty, and had spent most of them waiting for her to state some predictable grievance. She had begun to speak, something about a matter concerning the estate. He had cut her short, directed her to Garston, and returned to his ledgers before she had left the room. He had not offered her the chair. It was a lapse that had nagged at him afterward, not because of any sentiment, but because it was a breach of his own code. He was cold. He knew that. He was remote. But he was never deliberately discourteous to someone standing in his own house. The chair was ritual, protocol, a basic civilized gesture. He had failed it because he had already decided she was unimportant before she opened her mouth. Now, she was scrubbing his floors, and his dead sister's horse, wild with grief and fury for 6 months, was following her through the rain like a lamb. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Your Grace, it was Sedgwick." "Lady Hargrove has arrived. She is in the morning room, his aunt." Rowan closed his eyes briefly. Lady Hargrove was his mother's younger sister, sharp-tongued, perceptive, and entirely unintimidated by his title or his temperament. She visited Thornmere twice a year, ostensibly to check on the house, in reality, to check on him. "I'll be down presently," he said. He took one last look out the window. The woman and the horse had disappeared around the corner of the stable block. The yard was empty again, just wet cobblestones and gray sky. But the image stayed with him, the small figure with the heavy buckets, the great dark horse at her side, the two of them moving together in a silence that felt, for reasons he could not articulate, like something important he had overlooked. He turned from the window and straightened his coat. There was work to be done, accounts to reconcile, a difficult aunt to endure. But for the first time in months, the work did not fill his mind completely. A small persistent space had opened, a question he could not answer and could not stop asking. Who was she, and what had she come to tell him that morning that she had chosen to leave unsaid? The weeks that followed were a slow suffocation. Eleonora endured them the way her father had taught her to endure all things. With patience, with precision, with her eyes open and her mouth closed. She scrubbed the cellars until the stones gleamed wet in the lamplight. She sorted the mildewed linens in the third-floor storerooms, her fingers cracking in the cold. She hauled coal until her shoulders ached and the black dust settled into the creases of her palms like a second skin that no amount of washing could remove. Garston's campaign was relentless. He did not shout. He did not threaten directly. He simply arranged her world so that every hour was accounted for, every task was punishing, and every path through the house led her away from the places that mattered. The estate office, the room where his ledgers and private correspondence were kept, was on the ground floor of the east wing, behind a door she passed twice daily but could never linger near. She had mapped its location in her mind during her first week. She knew the hours when Garston was inside, the hours when he rode out to inspect the tenant farms, the brief window on Wednesday afternoons when he visited the solicitor in the village. But knowing the schedule was useless if she was always being watched. The other servants had become Garston's unwitting sentinels. Her isolation had made her conspicuous. A maid who ate alone, who worked in silence, who attracted the attention of both the untouchable horse and the Duke himself. She was a subject of endless whispered speculation. Every movement she made was noted and discussed. She could feel their eyes on her back in the corridors, hear the conversations that stopped when she entered a room. Her only ally was Vesper. The mare continued to find her. It did not matter where Garston assigned her, the cellars, the coal stores, the forgotten rooms on the upper floors. Vesper would appear at the nearest window or doorway, as if summoned by some invisible thread. The horse could not enter the house, but she would stand outside, her breath fogging the glass, her dark eyes patient and watchful. It was irrational, but Eleonora drew strength from it. The animal's loyalty was the one thing in Thornmere that could not be managed or reassigned. Lady Hargrove had been at Thornmere for 3 days. Eleonora had encountered her only once, carrying a tea tray through the morning room. But the encounter had left its mark. The older woman had looked at her with a gaze so penetrating it felt like being read aloud. "You are the girl the horse follows," she had said. It was not a question. "The horse has her own mind, my lady," Eleonora had replied, her eyes on the carpet. "Clearly," Lady Hargrove had said, and something in her tone, amusement or recognition or both, had made the hair on Eleonora's arms rise. That evening at dinner she had heard Lady Hargrove's voice carrying from the dining room as she cleared the service corridor. The words were indistinct, but the Duke's reply was not. "She is a housemaid, Aunt Constance." "I do not concern myself with the habits of housemaids." "Then perhaps you should," came the reply clear as a bell, "because that horse has better judgment than anyone in this house, and that includes you." The silence that followed was loud enough to hear through stone. It was that silence, the Duke's inability to answer, that made Eleanora act. Time was running out. Lady Hargrove's visit would end soon, and with it whatever subtle restraint her presence placed on Garston's authority. Eleanora had noticed that the steward was more careful when the Duke's aunt was in residence. His manner softer, his movements less proprietary. Once she left, the walls would close in again tighter than before. And there was something else. A conversation she had overheard between Garston and the estate solicitor, caught in fragments through a half-open window while she beat rugs in the courtyard. Transfer the remaining timber rights before the quarter audit. Holt's company is prepared to receive. They were still doing it. The theft was not a single act buried in the past. It was ongoing. Garston was still funneling the estate's assets to his brother. Every month she waited was another month of loss, another layer of evidence being buried or destroyed. She had to reach the estate office. She had to do it now. Wednesday was 3 days away. She could not wait for the afternoon window. It had to be at night, when the house was sleeping, when even Garston retired to his quarters in the steward's cottage beyond the stable yard. She chose Thursday. The reason was practical. Lady Hargrove was departing Friday morning, which meant Thursday evening would be occupied with farewell preparations. The household would be focused on the family rooms, leaving the east wing unattended. She went to bed at the usual hour, lying fully clothed beneath a thin blanket, listening to the sounds of the house settling into silence. The breathing of the other maids in the shared room, young Tilly, who talked in her sleep, and Bess, who snored softly like a contented cat, the creak of old timbers adjusting to the cold, the distant chime of the hall clock marking the quarters. At 1:30 she rose. She had removed her shoes hours ago to avoid the telltale sound of heels on wood. In stocking feet she eased the dormitory door open and slipped into the corridor. The darkness was absolute, a thick, living blackness that pressed against her eyes. She did not carry a candle. She had memorized the route. 14 steps to the end of the corridor, a right turn, 22 steps to the back staircase, down 2 flights, keeping to the left where the treads were firmest and the boards least likely to groan. Through the linen store at the bottom, 6 paces duck beneath the drying rack, and out into the ground floor service passage. The passage ran the length of the east wing, connecting the kitchens to the butler's pantry, and, beyond it, the estate office. The flagstones were ice beneath her feet. The air smelled of cold stone and the faint, lingering ghost of that evening's roast. She moved like water. Each step was tested before she committed her weight, her fingertips trailing the wall for guidance. Her heartbeat was a steady, controlled rhythm. She had learned long ago that panic made you clumsy, and clumsiness made you visible. The estate office door was locked. She had expected this. During her second week at Thormere, she had observed that Garston locked the office each evening and kept the key on a ring at his belt. But she had also observed that the office shared a wall with the butler's pantry, and that the pantry had a connecting door, an old servant's passage from the days when the steward and butler worked in closer quarters. That door had been papered over on the office side but was still functional from the pantry. She found the pantry door by touch. It was unlocked. Mr. Sedgwick kept it so for his early morning inventory. She slipped inside, navigating by memory around the cabinets of silver and the neatly stacked china. The connecting door was behind a tall shelf of decanters. She moved them carefully, one by one, setting each on the floor with the delicacy of a surgeon. The door handle was stiff, but turned without sound. She eased through the gap and found herself inside Garston's office. The room smelled of ink, tallow, and something else. Something sharp and astringent. Linseed oil, perhaps, from the polished wooden document cabinets that lined the far wall. A faint blue light seeped through the uncurtained window. Moonlight filtered through cloud. She stood still, letting her eyes adjust. The desk was a wide, orderly expanse. Ledgers were stacked on the left. A correspondence tray sat on the right. The cabinets, 5 of them, each with brass-handled drawers, occupied the entire wall behind the desk. She began with the correspondence tray. Her fingers moved through the papers with practiced speed, tilting each toward the pale window light. Invoices for feed grain, a letter from a tenant requesting repairs, a note from the solicitor confirming a meeting date, nothing. The ledgers. She opened the topmost one, the current year's estate accounts. The entries were in Garston's angular, precise hand. She scanned the columns, looking for irregularities, for payments to companies she recognized, for entries that matched the pattern Aldrich had identified. The numbers were dense, the abbreviations unfamiliar. She needed more time than she had. She turned to the cabinets. The first drawer she tried was locked. The second opened smoothly. She pulled it out and began to search, her fingers walking through the hanging files. Correspondence organized by month, receipts bundled with string, survey reports. Survey reports. Her breath caught. She pulled one out and tilted it toward the window. It was a boundary assessment dated nearly a decade ago, years before Aldrich had begun his survey, prepared by a firm she did not recognize. She opened it. The map inside showed Thornmere's northern boundary, but Blackthorn Hollow was not marked as estate land. It had been drawn as if it had never belonged to the Ashenmoors at all. A falsified assessment, prepared in advance. The fraud had been planned long before her father ever set foot on the property. Her hands were trembling. She needed to take this. She needed a sound, not inside the house. Outside, the scrape of a boot on gravel. Then, the unmistakable clinking of metal, a key ring. Someone was crossing the yard toward the east wing. Garston. He was coming back. At nearly 2 a.m, the steward was returning to his office. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. She shoved the file back into the drawer and eased it. Closed, the footsteps were closer now, on the flagstone path just outside the window. She heard the jangle of keys, the scrape of a key finding a lock. Not the office door. The outer door of the wing, 20 feet down the passage. He would pass the office on his way to where? Why was he here at this hour? She had seconds. She could not go back through the pantry. The decanters were still on the floor and the sound of replacing them would carry. She dropped to her knees and crawled beneath Garston's desk, pulling her skirts tight around her legs. Pressing herself into the dark cavity between the drawers, she heard the outer door open. Footsteps in the passage, measured and unhurried, then they stopped. Directly outside the office door, the key turned in the lock. The door opened. Garston entered the room. She heard him cross to the desk, the very desk beneath which she crouched, her pulse hammering in her ears. A match struck, the sharp flare of sulfur. A lamp was lit, and warm amber light flooded the room, stopping just short of the shadows where she hid. His boots were 6 inches from her hand. He sat down. The chair creaked. She heard the scratch of a pen, the rustle of paper. He was writing. At 2 a.m, the estate steward was at his desk, composing something that could not wait until daylight and could not, apparently, be written while the house was awake. She did not breathe. She did not move. She counted the seconds by the faint rhythmic creak of the chair as he shifted his weight. 1 minute, 2, 5. An eternity compressed into the space between the bottom of a desk and the cold stone floor. Then, salvation and disaster. A sound from outside. Not footsteps this time. A scream. High, wild, unmistakable. Vesper. The mare was calling from the paddock, a raw, piercing cry that split the night like torn fabric. Garston's pen stopped. His chair scraped back. He muttered something she could not hear, crossed the room, and went to the window. The mare screamed again. Garston muttered under his breath, took the lamp and left the office. She heard his footsteps receding down the passage toward the outer door. Eleanor did not wait. She slid out from beneath the desk, crossed the room in 3 strides, and went through the pantry door. She replaced the decanters by feel, her hands shaking so violently that 2 of them clinked against each other. A sound that seemed in the silence as loud as a cathedral bell. She eased the pantry door shut, and ran. Not gracefully, not silently. She ran through the service passage, up the back stairs, down the dormitory corridor, and through the door of her shared room. She was in bed, the blanket pulled to her chin, her chest heaving, before Tilly stirred in her sleep and murmured something about rain. Eleonora lay in the darkness, her body trembling, her mind racing. She had found the falsified assessment. She knew it existed. She knew where it was, but she had not taken it, and she could not go back. Garston would notice if anything was missing. He might already have noticed the decanters out of place, a drawer not fully closed, a disturbance in the air of his private room. And then there was Vesper. The mare had cried out at the exact moment Eleonora needed a distraction. Coincidence, perhaps. Or perhaps the animal had sensed, through some instinct beyond explanation, that the woman she had chosen was in danger. Eleonora pressed her face into the pillow and allowed herself one silent, shaking breath that was almost a sob. She was so close. The proof was there, in that cabinet, in that counterfeit map, in whatever Garston had been writing at 2 in the morning. But she was one woman alone in a house full of eyes, and the man she needed to expose was the man who controlled every lock and every key. She needed help. She needed the Duke, but the Duke had not even offered her a chair. She did not get the chance to decide. The next morning, before dawn had fully broken, Mr. Sedgwick appeared at the dormitory door with a face as gray as the light. "Nell, the Duke requires you in the study, immediately." The other maids watched her go with wide, frightened eyes. Tilly clutched her blanket to her chest. Bess crossed herself. Eleonora smoothed her apron, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and followed the butler down the corridor with the same measured stride she brought to everything. Her mind was a furnace of calculation. Had Garston found her out? Had he gone to the Duke? Were the decanters out of order? The drawer not fully closed? She catalogued every possible mistake, every trace she might have left. The connecting door, had she shut it completely? The pantry floor, had her stocking feet left marks in the dust? The study door was open. Sedgwick stepped aside, and she entered. The room was unchanged. The heavy desk, the tall windows, the chair, the velvet chair, sitting in its prescribed position, 3 hand-widths from the desk's edge. The fire had not yet been lit. The room was cold. The Duke stood behind the desk, not seated. He was in riding clothes, boots, breeches, a dark coat, as though he had been up for hours, or had never gone to bed. His face was unreadable, a landscape of sharp planes and deep shadows in the early light. Garston was not there. They were alone. "Close the door," the Duke said. She did. He did not speak immediately. He studied her, not the way he had the first time, that brief dismissive glance that had reduced her to an inconvenience. This was something different. His gaze moved across her face slowly, deliberately, as though he were reading a document written in a language he was only beginning to understand. "My aunt departed this morning," he began. "Before she left, she said something to me that I have not been able to set aside. She told me I should ask you what you came here to tell me. She said I would not like the answer, but that I needed to hear it." Eleonora's pulse quickened, but her face remained still. "I do not know what Lady Hargrove means, Your Grace." "I think you do." There was no softness in his tone. It was the voice of a man who had been turning a problem over in his mind for weeks, and had arrived at an answer he did not yet want to accept. He reached down and placed something on the desk between them. It was a glove. A woman's glove mended more than once, made of kidskin that had once been fine and was now worn almost through at the fingertips. "My aunt found this in the morning room," he continued. "She recognized it. She said it was the same glove worn by the woman who came to see me in October, the woman I turned away." Eleonora looked at the glove. She had not realized she had lost it. A careless mistake, the kind her father would never have made. "I will ask you once," the Duke said, his voice dropping. "Are you the woman who came to my study 6 weeks ago?" The lie was there, ready and waiting, a simple denial, a confused look. She was just a maid. She did not know what he was talking about. The words were on her tongue, but his eyes held her. They were not cold now. They were something far more dangerous. They were open. He was for the first time actually looking at her. Not past her. Not through her. At her. Yes, she said. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water. She watched the ripples cross his face, surprise though he had expected it. A flicker of something that might have been shame, and, beneath both, a sharp, urgent curiosity. Why did you come back as a servant? Because you told me to direct my business to your steward, and my business concerns your steward. The silence stretched. She could hear the clock on the mantel, the wind pressing against the windows, the distant sound of the kitchen beginning its morning clatter. Explain, he said. She took a breath. Not the full truth, not yet. She could not hand him the entire picture while she stood here powerless, a maid who could be dismissed with a word, but she could give him enough to crack the foundation. Your estate has been defrauded, she said, her voice steady and clear. A parcel of 600 acres on your northern boundary land called Blackthorn Hollow was transferred out of your family's holdings under fraudulent terms. The land is rich in coal. The profits from its extraction are considerable, and none of them have reached Thornmere. The transfer was arranged by a man named Holt Garston. She paused. He is your steward's elder brother. The Duke did not move. His expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a recalculation, a machine grinding to a halt and beginning to turn in the opposite direction. He placed both hands flat on the desk as if steadying himself against a blow that had not yet fully landed. That is a serious accusation, he said. His voice was dangerously level. It is a documented fact. My father was the surveyor who discovered the discrepancy. He was destroyed for it. His reputation, his livelihood, his health. He died before he could bring the proof to your father. I came here to bring it to you, your father, Aldrich Severin. He was commissioned by the late Duke to survey this estate's boundaries. He completed the work, he found the fraud, and before he could present his findings, he was silenced. A muscle in the Duke's jaw tightened. He straightened, his hands leaving the desk, clasping behind his back, in a posture she had come to recognize, the stance of a man containing something volatile. You are telling me, he said slowly, each word measured and precise, that you entered my household under a false name, deceived my staff, and concealed your identity to investigate my own steward. I am telling you that I tried the honest way first. I stood in this room and tried to speak the truth. You did not offer me a chair. You did not offer me a minute. You sent me to the very man who had buried that truth. The words landed. She saw them strike, not with anger, but with the precise surgical force of a fact that could not be argued with. His jaw tightened further. He looked away from her, toward the window, and for a long moment the only sounds in the room were the ticking of the mantel clock and the faint moan of the October wind against the glass. When he turned back, his voice was different. The authority was still there, but the coldness had cracked, and through the crack she could see something raw, a glimpse of the man behind the title, struggling to reconcile what he had believed with what he was being told. What is your name? Your real name? Eleonora Severin. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already begun to suspect. Then he did something she did not expect. He pulled the velvet chair away from the desk and turned it to face her. Sit down, Miss Severin, he said. It was not an apology. It was not a grand gesture. It was a man correcting a failure, quietly, deliberately, with the full weight of understanding behind it. She looked at the chair, the same chair she had stood beside 6 weeks ago while he dismissed her without hearing a word. The velvet was dark burgundy, the wooden legs carved with a pattern of acanthus leaves, details she had memorized during those 3 futile minutes when she had stared at the chair she was never invited to occupy. She sat. Now, he said, lowering himself into his own chair on the opposite side of the desk, so that they faced each other as equals for the first time. "Tell me everything." And she did. She told him about Aldrich's survey, how her father had walked every fence line and compared every deed to every stone marker. She told him about the forged transfer, the company registered to Holt Garston, the coal profits bleeding from the estate, like a wound no one could see. She told him about the anonymous complaints, the fabricated charges of fraud, and how a quiet, meticulous man had been erased from the professional register, as cleanly as Blackthorn Hollow had been erased from the estate maps. She told him about her father's death, the rented room, the failing breath, the promise extracted at the bedside. Her voice did not waver, but something in her face must have betrayed the cost, because the Duke looked away briefly, as if to grant her a moment of privacy. She told him about the falsified boundary assessment she had found in Garston's records, evidence that the fraud had been premeditated, planned years in advance. And she told him about Garston's late-night visit to his own office, the steward writing something at 2 a.m. that could not wait for daylight. The Duke listened without interruption. His face grew harder with each detail, not with anger at her, but with the slow, building fury of a man realizing he has been robbed by the person he trusted most. She watched his hands tighten on the arms of his chair, the knuckles whitening, then deliberately release, control, always control. But beneath it, a fury so deep it seemed to darken the very air around him. When she finished, the silence was heavy. The clock ticked. The fire that had not been lit left the room in a chill that felt appropriate to the subject. "You have proof," he said at last. "Your father's documents. They are not here. They are in a safe place. I was not foolish enough to bring them into this house." A ghost of something. Respect, perhaps, flickered across his face. She realized it was the first time she had seen him look at anyone with anything other than distance or duty. And the falsified assessment in Garston's office. "I saw it. I know which drawer. But I could not take it without alerting him." He stood and walked to the window. The morning had brightened. The stable yard was busy now, grooms leading horses, a cart being loaded with hay bales. Somewhere beyond the stables, Vesper would be standing at her fence watching the house. "Garston has been with this estate for over a decade," he said, his back to her. "I trusted him with everything. My father trusted him before me." "My father trusted that his work would speak for itself," she replied quietly. "Trust is not the same as truth." He turned. His expression had settled into something resolute, the cold, clear focus of a man who has made a decision and will not be moved from it. She had seen that expression on her father's face in the weeks before he presented his findings. The look of a man who has found the discrepancy and will follow it to its source, no matter the cost. "You will not return to the servants' quarters," he said. "You will not scrub another floor. From this moment, you are a guest of this house. Under my personal protection, you will stay in the guest apartments. Your Grace, if Garston sees, Garston will see nothing. I will deal with Garston. You cannot simply dismiss him. He will destroy the evidence." "I have no intention of dismissing him," the Duke said. "Not yet. First, I am going to find out exactly how much he has stolen, and you are going to help me." He moved toward the door, then stopped. His hand rested on the frame, and he stood with his back to her for a moment, as if weighing something fragile and important. "Miss Severin," he turned. His expression had changed again, the hard resolve softened by something more uncertain, more human. "I owe you an apology. Not for today, for the first time you stood in this room." She met his gaze. "You owe me nothing, Your Grace. I did not come here for an apology. I came here for justice." "Then you shall have it," he said. "I give you my word." He left. His footsteps receded down the corridor, steady and purposeful, until the house swallowed the sound. It was only then that Eleonora realized her hands were shaking. Not with fear, with something far more unsettling. She had been heard. After 2 years of silence, of invisibility, of carrying her father's burden alone, someone had listened, someone had believed her. And the look in his eyes when he had pulled out that chair. The quiet, deliberate act of a man trying to undo a wrong had lodged itself somewhere behind her ribs where she could not reach it and could not remove it. She pressed her hands flat against the arms of the velvet chair and breathed. She was still sitting in it. The transformation was immediate, and it was devastating. By noon, the entire household knew that the quiet maid called Nell had been moved from the servants' dormitory to the guest apartments. Her gray uniform had been replaced by a simple but respectable dress, one of Lady Hargrove's, left behind and altered hastily by the seamstress from the village. She no longer ate in the kitchen. A tray was brought to her room. The whispers were a wildfire. "She's his mistress," hissed the cook's assistant to anyone who would listen. "Plain as the nose on your face." Young Tilly, who had shared a room with her for weeks, wept with confusion, not out of malice but because she had liked the quiet maid and could not reconcile the Nell she knew with the rumors spreading through the house like smoke. Sedgwick, the butler, maintained a dignified silence, but his eyebrows had not descended from his hairline since breakfast. Garstin said nothing. That was what frightened Eleanora most. The steward continued his duties with his usual smooth efficiency, consulting with the Duke on tenant matters, reviewing the week's accounts, riding out to inspect the drainage work on the lower fields. If he suspected anything, his face betrayed nothing. But Eleanora noticed small changes, deliberate methodical adjustments that only someone watching closely would catch. He had begun locking the outer door at night, something he had not done before. His evening visits to the estate office had become longer and more frequent. And twice she saw him carrying bundles of papers from the office to the steward's cottage, his stride brisk, his ledger tucked under his arm like a shield. He was fortifying. Whether he knew the specific threat or merely sensed a shift in the wind, he was tightening his grip on the records that held his secrets. The question was whether he was merely protecting them or beginning to destroy them. The Duke moved with a patience that surprised her. She had expected confrontation, a man of his temperament and authority, simply summoning Garstin and demanding an accounting. Instead, Rowan was methodical. He asked Eleanora to describe in precise detail every document Aldrich had prepared. He had her draw the maps from memory, the boundary lines, the parcel numbers, the location of the original survey markers. He compared them, line by line, against the estate records he kept in his own study, records that Garstin had prepared for him. The discrepancies were glaring once you knew where to look. Blackthorn Hollow appeared in the Duke's own ledgers as freehold disposed, with a date and a reference number but no further detail, no valuation, no buyer, no record of the proceeds. 600 acres of prime woodland had vanished from the estate's books as cleanly as if it had never existed.
"My father held the original deeds,"
Eleanora said, seated across from the Duke at his desk, maps spread between them like a battlefield. "The one signed by your grandfather. The land was part of the original Tudor grant. It could not have been legally transferred without the consent of the heir, your father, and a formal petition to the Crown estate, none of which exists." His voice was flat, controlled, but she could see the fury beneath it, a cold, white heat behind his eyes. "No, the transfer document Garstin filed uses a forged signature and a fabricated legal instrument. My father identified both. Where are Aldrich's documents now?" "In the safekeeping of a friend, a vicar in Calderbridge, 3 miles from here. He does not know what they contain, only that they are precious to me." The Duke nodded. "We will retrieve them, but not yet. Not until I have seen the inside of Garstin's records for myself." Lady Hargrove, informed by letter, played her part from a distance. She sent a formal note to the Duke expressing her delight that a young woman of good family had been found in reduced circumstances at Thornmere, and praising her nephew's Christian charity and offering her a position as companion and librarian. The letter was left, with calculated carelessness, on the silver tray in the entrance hall, where every servant in the house would read it by nightfall. It was a fiction, but it was an elegant one. It provided a plausible explanation for Eleanora's sudden elevation and deflected the most damaging gossip. It also signaled to Garstin, in terms he could not mistake, that the Duke's aunt, a woman of considerable social influence, had taken a personal interest in the new arrival. Garston's response was a masterpiece of restraint. He congratulated the Duke on his aunt's recommendation. He expressed his pleasure at the young woman's improved circumstances. His smile never reached his eyes. Eleonora watched him from the windows of the guest apartments, crossing the stable yard with his ledger under his arm, his stride as measured and purposeful as ever, and felt the familiar cold weight of fear in her stomach. He knew something was wrong. He did not yet know what. But he was a man who had spent more than a decade building a system of theft, so elegant it was invisible, and he would not surrender it without a fight. Vesper, as if sensing the gathering storm, had grown restless. The mare paced the paddock fence for hours, her ears pricked toward the house, her dark gaze following every movement in the yard. Twice she called out, that raw, piercing cry, and both times Eleonora went to the window and pressed her hand against the glass. "I know," she whispered. "I know." The Duke went alone. He waited until a night when Garston was dining with the solicitor in the village, a regular Thursday engagement that kept the steward away until late. Rowan took the key from Sedgwick's ring, the master key that opened every door in Thornmere, a key the steward did not know the Duke possessed. The estate office was exactly as Eleonora had described it. The desk, the correspondence tray, the 5 cabinets against the wall, the smell of ink and linseed oil, the cold, meticulous order of a man who believed his secrets were safe. He felt an unexpected revulsion standing in this room. He had been here hundreds of times, reviewing accounts, approving expenditures, trusting the neat columns and careful summaries that Garston laid before him. This desk, this room, had been the engine of his estate's governance, and all of it, every figure and every page, had been built on a lie. Rowan found the falsified boundary assessment in the second cabinet, the same drawer Eleonora had described. He spread it on the desk beneath the lamplight and studied it with the trained eye of a man who had spent years reading maps of his own land. The northern boundary had been redrawn. Blackthorn Hollow was simply absent, erased, as if it had never existed, replaced by a clean false line that ended where the estate's legitimate holdings began. It was exquisite work. The cartography was professional, the paper aged convincingly, the seals authentic. Without Aldrich Severin's original survey to compare it against, no one would have questioned it, but Rowan had more than suspicion now. He had Eleonora's memory, precise, detailed, trained by a father who had taught her to read land the way other children learned to read books. She had described the original boundary markers, the carved stones placed by his own grandfather, and Rowan had ridden out 2 days ago and found 3 of them half buried in bracken and leaf mold, exactly where she said they would be. Mouse. The land was his. It had always been his. He searched the locked drawer next. The lock yielded to a letter opener. The mechanism was old and poorly maintained, the one element of Garston's office that reflected overconfidence, rather than care. Inside, he found what Eleonora had predicted he would find. A ledger. Not the estate's official accounts, but a private record. Garston's personal accounting of the Blackthorn Hollow operation. It was meticulous, damning, and comprehensive. Payments received from 2 mining companies. Commissions paid to Holt Garston's firm. Expenses for the counterfeit boundary map. The fabricated complaints against Aldrich Severin, the replacement solicitor who had handled the fraudulent transfer. Every shilling accounted for. Every crime annotated in the same angular hand that balanced Thornmere's legitimate books. The final entry was dated 3 days ago. A notation of a planned transfer, the remaining timber rights on the northern boundary to be signed over to Holt's company before the end of the quarter. The very transaction Eleonora had overheard through the courtyard window. Rowan sat at Garston's desk for a long time. The lamp burned low. The house was silent around him. He thought about his father, who had trusted this man. He thought about his sister who had laughed in these corridors, who had ridden her black mare across this land, never knowing that a piece of it was being carved away beneath her feet. He thought about Aldrich Severin, a good man destroyed for the crime of telling the truth. And he thought about Eleonora, the woman who had walked into his study, carrying the weight of all this knowledge, and had been dismissed without a chair. The woman who had come back as a servant, scrubbed his floors, endured his steward's cruelties, and never once complained. The woman whose quiet, unbreakable dignity had done what nothing else could. It had made him pay attention. He closed the private ledger, placed it inside his coat, returned the office to its original state, and locked the door behind him. He walked back through the silent house, past the sleeping servants, past the cold fireplaces and the dark portraits on the walls, and climbed the stairs to the guest wing. He stopped outside Eleanor's door. He could see the faint line of candlelight beneath it. She was still awake. He did not knock. Not tonight. Tomorrow. He would show her what he had found. Tomorrow, they would plan the reckoning. But tonight he stood in the dark corridor and allowed himself to feel the full, staggering weight of what she had done. She had come to save his estate, and he had sent her away. She had come back, alone, and fought for it anyway. Not for money, not for revenge. For a promise made to a dying man. He pressed his hand flat against the wall beside her door, a gesture no one would ever see, and spoke a single word, barely audible, meant for no one but himself. Forgive me. Then he turned and walked to his own rooms, the stolen ledger burning against his chest like a living coal. The reckoning came on a Sunday. Rowan chose the day deliberately. Garston attended church every week without fail, part of his carefully maintained performance of respectability. He would return to Thornmere at noon, expecting the quiet, orderly house he had controlled for more than a decade. He would not find it. The Duke had arranged the study with the same precision. Garston applied to his ledgers. The velvet chair was in its usual place, but behind the desk now sat 2 seats, one for the Duke, one for Eleonora. Quote, on the desk's surface, arranged in careful rows, were the documents, Aldrich Severin's original survey maps, retrieved from the vicar in Calderbridge, the falsified assessment from Garston's cabinet, the private ledger, the original Tudor deeds preserved among the late Duke's papers, which Rowan had found himself after 3 days of searching the library, and the letters, Aldrich's correspondence with the old Duke, including one final desperate appeal written just weeks before the anonymous complaints destroyed him. Eleonora sat in the chair beside the Duke. She wore a simple dark blue dress, her own, retrieved from the trunk she had stored at the boarding house. Her father's satchel lay open on the desk, its contents finally delivered. Her hands were folded in her lap. They were steady. Garston entered the study at 12:30, summoned by Sedgwick. He was still in his Sunday coat, his face composed, his bearing upright. He glanced at Eleonora, and for the first time she saw something flicker behind his eyes, a recalculation, quick and sharp, like a card player realizing the deck has been changed. Your Grace wished to see me, he said, his voice smooth as ever. I did. The Duke did not stand. He did not gesture to a chair. You are familiar with a piece of land called Blackthorn Hollow. It was not a question. Garston's expression did not change, but his hands, clasped behind his back, went still. It is a parcel on the northern boundary, he replied. Disposed of some years ago, I believe, before my time as steward. It was disposed of during your time as steward. The Duke's voice was quiet, unhurried, devastating. By your brother, using forged documents that bear my father's signature. He placed his hand on the private ledger. And the profits have been flowing to your brother's company ever since. Over a decade, Garston, over a decade of theft, recorded in your own hand. The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense, compressed, like the air before a thunderclap. Garston's gaze dropped to the ledger, then to the maps, then to the counterfeit boundary assessment. She watched the understanding move through him, not suddenly but in stages, like a building losing its supports one by one. "Where did you?" he began. "From your own desk." The Duke's voice had not risen. It did not need to. "From the cabinet you thought no one would ever open. From the drawer you locked with a mechanism a letter opener could defeat." Each word carried the weight of absolute documented certainty. Garston turned to Eleonora. The smooth mass crumbled. Beneath it was something raw, not remorse, but a cold-cornered fury. "Her," he said. "She put you up to this. She is a fraud, Your Grace, a confidence woman. I warned you. You warned me about many things." The Duke cut across him, his tone as sharp as sheared steel. "You warned me that the horse was dangerous. You warned me that the maid was trouble. You warned me that my father's surveyor was a fraud." He paused, letting each word settle. "And every warning was a lie, designed to protect the only fraud in this house, you." He picked up the final letter, Aldrich Severin's last appeal to the old Duke. "This man came to my father for help. He had discovered your brother's theft and tried to report it. You destroyed him. You filed false complaints. You had his name struck from the professional register. You took his livelihood, his reputation, and his health. He died in a rented room with nothing but his daughter and his documents." The Duke's voice dropped, and for the first time, the cold control wavered. Something deeper showed through. Grief, perhaps, or its close cousin, shame. "His daughter," Rowan continued, "is sitting in this room. She came to me 6 weeks ago to present the proof. I sent her away without hearing a word. She came back as a servant in my own household and endured your petty cruelties because she had made a promise to her dying father. She has more courage and more honor than anyone I have ever known. And you—" His gaze locked onto Garston with a force that made the steward take a physical step backward. "You are not worthy to stand in the same room." Garston's composure had collapsed entirely. His face was the color of ash. His mouth worked, but no sound emerged. He looked from the Duke to Eleonora, from the documents on the desk to the door, as if calculating whether escape was still possible. It was not. "What will you do?" he whispered. "Your brother will be prosecuted. The land will be recovered. The profits will be repaid. My solicitors have already been instructed." The Duke stood. "As for you, you will leave this house today. You will take nothing with you except what you wore when you arrived. The magistrate will be informed. Whether you face charges yourself will depend on the extent of your involvement, and I suspect your own ledger will answer that question clearly enough." He rang the bell. Sedgwick appeared, accompanied by 2 footmen. "Mr. Min, Garston is leaving Thornmere. See that he is escorted to the gate." Garston stood motionless for a moment. Then, without a word, without a plea, without a defense, without so much as a backward glance, he walked out of the room. His footsteps echoed down the long corridor, growing fainter, and then they were gone. The door closed. The room was silent. Eleonora sat in the chair and felt the weight of 2 years, of grief, of fear, of relentless, exhausting vigilance, lift from her shoulders like a physical thing. Her vision blurred. She pressed her fingers to her eyes and breathed, "Miss Severin." The Duke's voice was close. She opened her eyes. He had come around the desk and was standing before her, holding something out. Her father's satchel. Closed now, the document safe inside. He held it the way one holds something precious, with both hands, with care. "Your father's work is done," he said. "His name will be restored. I will see to it personally." She took the satchel. The leather was warm from his hands. She held it against her chest, the same way she had held it walking down his gravel drive 6 weeks ago, full of words unspoken. And for the first time in 2 years, she wept, not with grief, with relief, with the unbearable, overwhelming knowledge that it was finished, that her father's truth had survived, that someone, finally, impossibly, had listened. Rowan did not touch her. He did not speak. He simply stood beside the velvet chair and waited, as steady and immovable as the old stones of his house. While she cried, 8 months later, the first wildflowers appeared on the moors above Thornmere. The winter had been long and bitter, weeks of iron frost and horizontal rain that turned the parkland into a gray, waterlogged expanse. But spring, when it came with a fierce, compensatory beauty. The hills turned green overnight. The river swelled and ran clear. The old oaks along the drive unfurled their leaves like flags of surrender to the warmth. Eleonora stood at the tall windows of the estate library, her library now, though she still thought of it with a faint disbelief, and watched the light change across the valley. The room behind her smelled of beeswax and old paper. New shelves lined the far wall, built by a joiner from the village to house the collection of maps and survey records. She was cataloging Aldrich's work, the late Duke's papers, and the estate's historical archives which had been neglected for decades. She was no longer a maid. She was no longer a guest. She was Thornmere's estate cartographer and archivist, a position the Duke had created for her, with a salary, a title, and a suite of rooms that were hers by right, not by charity. The change had not come easily. The household had taken weeks to adjust. Some of the servants, Tilly, the young maid who had shared her dormitory, chief among them, had accepted her new identity with wide-eyed, uncomplicated delight. Others had been slower, suspicious of a transformation that seemed too sudden, too dramatic to be entirely innocent. But Eleonora had won them over, the same way she won over everything, quietly, steadily, by being exactly who she was. She had taken over the management of the household accounts, Garston's former domain, with a competence that astonished even Sedgwick. She had reorganized the estate's record system, replacing the steward's elaborate obfuscation with a transparency so clear that any literate person could follow the money from source to ledger. She had without fanfare made Thornmere's finances legible for the first time in over a decade. The legal proceedings against Holt Garston were well advanced. The Duke's solicitors, armed with Aldrich's original documents and the steward's private ledger, had built a case so comprehensive that Holt's own lawyers had advised him to negotiate. Blackthorn Hollow had been formally restored to the Ashenmore estate. The mining revenues, substantial and growing, were now flowing into Thornmere's accounts. The counterfeit boundary assessment had been entered into evidence. Aldrich Severin's name had been officially cleared by the county surveyor's office, with a formal letter of apology that Eleonora kept in her father's satchel, beside his original maps. She touched the satchel now. It sat on the corner of her desk, no longer a burden but a talisman, a reminder of the man who had drawn these lines, walked these boundaries, and given his life to the truth. "You did it, Papa," she said softly. "We did it." A sound at the door made her turn. Rowan stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame. He had changed in these 8 months, or perhaps he had simply allowed himself to be seen. The severe black coats were less frequent now. His face, while still serious, had lost the granite rigidity that had once made him seem carved from the same stone as his house. He smiled, more often a slight, almost reluctant curve of the lips that Eleonora had learned to read as clearly as her father's maps. "The boundary markers have been reset," he said. "All 12. The surveyor confirmed them this morning." "Good," she said. "My father would have insisted on checking them himself." "Your father would have been right." He entered the room and stood beside her at the window. They looked out at the valley together, the green hills, the distant line of trees that marked the edge of Blackthorn Hollow, the wide sky streaked with the pale gold of late afternoon. "Vesper is in the lower meadow," he said. "She seems content." The mare had transformed as completely as the estate. With Garston gone and Eleonora's presence a daily constant, Vesper had shed her wildness like a winter coat. She grazed in the open fields now glossy-coated and calm. She still followed Eleonora when she walked the grounds, but the frantic, desperate energy was gone. In its place was a companionship, steady, warm, and undemanding. The Duke had ridden her last month. It was the first time since Rosabel's death. Eleonora had watched from the library window as he mounted and rode out across the moor, the black mare moving beneath him with an easy, flowing stride. When he returned, his eyes were bright and his face was open in a way she had never seen before. Rosabelle would be pleased, he had said, and it was the first time she had heard him speak his sister's name without flinching. Now, standing beside her at the window, he was quiet for a long moment. She had learned his silences, the working silence when he was calculating, the heavy silence when he was grieving, and this one, the rarest, the silence of a man gathering his nerve. "Eleonora," he said. He had begun using her name 2 months ago. The first time, in this very room, over a disputed boundary line on a Tudor map, it had stopped them both mid-sentence, a word so charged it changed the air in the room. "Rowan," she said. She had started using his a week later. The exchange of names had felt like the exchange of something far more significant, a quiet, mutual surrender of the roles they had been hiding behind. "I am not a man who speaks easily," he said. "You know this. I do. I have spent 8 months watching you restore my estate, clear your father's name, and bring order to a house that was failing long before I understood it. I have watched you do all of this with a grace and a strength that he paused, his jaw tightened, then released, that I did not deserve to witness, given how I first received you. You have more than made up for that," she said gently. "I have not," he said, "but I would like to spend the rest of my life trying." He turned to face her. His expression was open, unguarded, a landscape without walls for the first time since she had known him. "I'm asking you to stay, not as my archivist, not as a guest under my roof, as my wife, as the Duchess of Ashenmore." She looked at him, this severe, principled, quietly broken man who had learned to see because a horse had shown him the way and a woman had refused to be invisible. "I told you once that I did not come here for an apology," she said. "I came for justice. And now," his voice was barely above a whisper, "now I find that justice was only the beginning." She reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm, steady, certain. "Yes," she said. He did not kiss her. That was not his way. Not yet. Instead, he lifted her hand and pressed it briefly to his forehead, a gesture so private, so unguarded, that it said more than any declaration could. Outside, in the lower meadow, Vesper raised her head from the grass and looked toward the house. The light caught her coat, turning the black to burnished bronze. She stood perfectly still for a moment, as if listening to something carried on the wind, a shift, a resolution, a promise kept. And then she lowered her head again and returned to the quiet business of grazing in the last warm light of the day. Thornmere was whole again, not because the land had been recovered or the books set straight, but because the house had finally done what it should have done from the beginning. It had offered her a chair,